Every railroad postcard from the golden age of steam told the same LIE. The locomotive gleaming, the engineer proud. But someone is missing. The fireman, shoveling 2 tons of coal per hour into a firebox above 1,000 degrees. Railroads did not just cut him from the advertising. They buried what was killing him. Boiler pressures surging past the limit before tearing cabs apart. Widows waiting 18 months for a $4,800 payout on a life. The dark truth behind these men is not just how they suffered. It is that an entire industry was designed to make sure you would never know they existed. Steam sold itself as progress. Every glossy postcard, every magazine ad, every railroad calendar, each one promised speed, power, and a future racing just beyond the horizon. The locomotive gleamed, a silver bullet against the sky. The Empire on Wheels, read a 1907 postcard, its swirling Art Nouveau letters crowning the image of a spotless engine. No soot, no sweat, no sign of struggle. The engineer sometimes appeared, arm raised, the very picture of command. But the fireman, the man who fed the beast, was never there. Not even a mention. The back of that postcard offered a poem to steel and steam, but not a word for the hands blistered raw in the cab. Railroads knew the power of myth. They sold the public on the promise of adventure, of jobs that lifted men from the dirt and set them on the rails to glory. Opportunity awaits, the recruiting posters claimed, as if the path to prosperity lay straight through the firebox. The truth was buried under layers of ink and optimism. Every ad left out the choking coal dust, the heat that warped bones, the knowledge that a single missed gauge or a faulty valve could turn a shift into a death sentence. The companies did not just erase the danger, they erased the men who faced it. In the golden age of steam, the worker became a ghost, sacrificed to keep the machine running and the legend alive. The public saw only the shine. The cost, measured in lives, was hidden in plain sight. In the shadows, behind every polished locomotive, a man stands alone, his face smeared with soot, his shirt plastered to his back with sweat. He has no name in the company brochures, no place on the commemorative plaques. The fireman is a silhouette half lit by the furnace he feeds and half lost in the smoke that chokes the cab. His hands grip the shovel, knuckles white, muscles burning from the endless rhythm of lifting, tossing, lifting again. The world outside sees only the gleam of the engine, the promise of speed, the adventure of the open rail. Inside, the fireman breathes air thick with coal dust, his lungs filling with grit, his eyes stinging from the heat that warps steel and flesh alike. No one asks about the man whose back bends with every mile. No one remembers who kept the pressure steady, who watched the water glass for the deadly drop, who risked being boiled alive if a single valve failed. The fireman's portrait is missing from the archives, his story wiped clean by the same hands that polished the brass. In the rare photograph that survives, he stands in the cab, almost unrecognizable, face blackened, eyes hollow, caught in a moment between shovelfuls. He is not the hero of the railroad myth. He is its casualty. The golden age of steam demanded bodies to fuel its legend. The fireman was both the engine's beating heart and its most disposable part. When disaster struck, it was his name that never made the papers, his family that waited for a letter that never came. The cost of progress was measured not just in miles, but in men erased, swept away like ash from the firebox, leaving only the shine for history to remember. The myth of the iron horse runs on sweat. Inside the cab, the fireman's arms never stop moving. Shovel hits coal, coal hits fire, again and again, 30 to 45 times a minute. The rhythm is brutal, mechanical, almost inhuman. Each scoop weighs 50 pounds, and there is no room for hesitation. On a steep grade, the demand doubles. 2 tons of coal an hour, every hour, just to keep the pressure up and the train alive. That is over 4,000 pounds, enough to break a man twice over before noon. The firebox roars 1,000 degrees, heat blasting through layers of soaked cotton and scorched skin. The air is thick with soot and ash, every breath a mouthful of grit. The fireman bends and lifts, shoulders screaming, back on the edge of collapse. There is no glory here, only the endless demand of the furnace. Miss a beat, and the steam drops. Miss 2, and the engineer curses, the schedule slips, the whole machine threatens to stall. Railroad managers called this unskilled labor. They wrote quotas into the rule books. 1 ton per hour for freight, 2 for express, up to 4.5 on the biggest engines. The numbers look clean on paper. In the cab, they mean an unbroken marathon. One man racing a clock that never slows, shoveling coal until his hands bleed and his legs shake. No one counts the shovelfuls. No one records the moment his muscles give out. The only thing that matters is the pressure gauge, the pounding of the pistons, the fireman's body feeding the beast. This is not the story on the postcards. The fireman's marathon is invisible, a blur of motion, a blur of pain. The train glides past towns and fields, but inside, a man is burning up mile by mile, erased by the very rhythm that keeps the legend alive. The cab becomes an oven before the sun climbs above the rails. Temperatures inside reach 45, sometimes 55 degrees Celsius, a heat that blurs vision, soaks shirts through, and leaves skin raw. Open the firebox door and a blast of air hotter than a desert wind hits the face. The fireman stands just feet from a furnace burning above 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, close enough to feel his eyebrows curl, his lips crack, his breath sear with every inhale. There is no escape. Each shovelful costs more than sweat. The body burns through over 4,000 calories in a shift, more than a marathon runner, but without the finish line or the cheering crowd. Hunger gnaws at the belly, but the stomach turns with the stench of burning coal and hot metal. Water boils in the bottle before it can cool a parched throat. Muscles cramp, hands blister and split, but the rhythm cannot break. The fire does not wait for mercy. Coal dust floats in the air, settling in the lungs with every breath. By age 40, a fireman's cough is as steady as the pistons beat. Medical surveys from the 1930s found chronic lung disease in more than 15% of firemen, black lungs, bronchitis, emphysema, diseases that ate away at life long before retirement. Soot cakes the teeth, eyes sting. The world narrows to a tunnel of heat and grit. No one records the moment a back gives out or a shoulder tears. No one tracks the damage done by days spent in a rolling inferno. The company logbooks note the tons of coal, the miles traveled. They do not mention the fireman who stumbles off the engine at shift's end, trembling, gasping, older by years after a single run. The cost is written in flesh, in lungs that harden to stone, in hearts that race and fail, erased from memory as easily as wiping soot from a window. The fireman's body is the first casualty, sacrificed to keep the engine moving, invisible in the glow of progress. Pressure built with every frantic shovelful. The fireman's arms never stopped, sweat poured, lungs burned, but the gauge kept climbing. The engineer barked for more steam, his eyes on the clock, not the needle. In the roar and glare, the fireman squinted at the water glass. Just a flicker, a shimmer, a guess at the level. One slip, one heartbeat too long. The water dropped below the crown sheet. The furnace raged hotter. The metal above it began to soften. Still, the shovel rose and fell. Still, the pressure climbed. The safety valve should have saved them. It was set for 180 pounds per square inch, but rust and neglect had welded it shut. The number on the dial kept rising. 190, 200, 205. No relief, no warning. The fireman's hands were shaking now, knuckles white around the shovel, but there was no stopping. At 210 pounds per square inch, the boiler became a bomb. Steel groaned, rivets strained, and then, in a split second, the world split open. The fireman's body, his labor, his vigilance, his fear, was erased in an instant. The company logbook would call it equipment failure. The truth was written in the chain: fatigue, a missed reading, a silent valve, and a pressure surge that turned flesh to ash. A widow stands in a silent room, her hands folded around a letter stamped with the seal of the Interstate Commerce Commission. It has been 18 months since the blast tore her world apart. 18 months of waiting, of hearings, of signatures and affidavits. The coroner's report calls it equipment failure. The company's lawyer calls it contributory negligence. The ledger calls it a loss. One fireman, age 34, survived by a wife and 2 children. There is no ceremony, no public reckoning. Instead, there is a number: $4,800. That is the price of a life, calculated by statute and delivered in a settlement check. The sum is less than a year's engineer's wage, less than the value of the engine's brass. It arrives after 18 months of forms and denials, after the company's final appeal fails. The widow receives the check with a trembling hand and a warning. Acceptance means silence, no further claim, no right to protest the terms. On the company's balance sheet, the fireman's death becomes a line item. The ICC code is entered, the payout recorded, the case closed. The man whose body fed the furnace is reduced to a claim number, his suffering translated into dollars and cents. The machine rolls on. The cost of progress is paid not in memory, but in paperwork. The ledger is balanced. The story is erased. Payroll ledgers tell a story colder than steel. The fireman's name is a number, his labor a calculation. 30 to 45% of an engineer's wage. That is what the company says a fireman is worth. Not enough to buy a house, barely enough to feed a family. The ledger does not record the weight of the coal, the hours lost to pain, the nights spent coughing up soot. It records a wage, $30 to $45 a month, while the engineer beside him takes home double. The companies called it fair, called it the price of opportunity, but the math did not stop there. To keep the pressure up and the profits higher, some railroads dangled a bonus, 10 cents for every ton of coal shoveled above quota. A fireman who broke his back to feed the furnace faster could earn an extra $1 on a brutal day. That bonus was bait, a prize for pushing the body past its limits, for risking a slip, a missed gauge, a fatal mistake. The more coal moved, the more money saved on schedules, the more risk shifted onto the man with the shovel. There was no hazard pay, no formal danger allowance. The company called the job unskilled, justified the low wage, and left the fireman to carry the cost. Training was a formality, 30 hours of apprenticeship, then straight to the cab, fines for missed readings, blacklisting for mistakes. The fireman's value was measured in tons, in minutes, in dollars. If he faltered, there was always another man waiting, another name to enter in the ledger. The cost of a life, calculated and forgotten, buried in company books as just another expense. The tools, meant to stand between a fireman and death, sat bolted to the boiler, ignored, neglected, or quietly sabotaged by the same companies that called the men who used them unskilled. Technical manuals from the 1900s listed every safeguard: the safety valve, the fusible plug, the water glass. Each device could have made the cab less of a death trap. The safety valve was supposed to release steam at 180 pounds per square inch, a last warning before the boiler became a bomb. The water glass, a simple tube, offered the only real clue to how close the fireman was to disaster. The fusible plug, a plug of soft metal, would melt and vent steam if the water dropped too low, giving a fleeting chance to escape. But these lifelines were only as good as the maintenance behind them. Inspection logs from the era are filled with skipped tests, rusted valves, and plugs so caked with ash they might as well have been welded shut. Boiler Inspection Act reports from 1911 onward show that many explosions had nothing to do with bad luck or bad design. They happened because a safety valve hadn't been checked in years, or a water glass was left clouded with scale. The devices were there, but the will to keep them working was not. Mechanical stokers, machines that could have spared a man's back and lungs, were available by the 1920s. Still, most firemen kept shoveling by hand, their bodies cheaper to replace than a new piece of equipment. The company ledger called them expendable. The accident reports called them casualties. The technology sat unused, a silent witness to how little the system valued the men it claimed were too unskilled to deserve more. The tools of survival existed, but the men who needed them most were left to face the fire alone. They called him unskilled, a body with a shovel, a name that could be crossed out and replaced before the coal dust settled. But the fireman knew better. 30 hours of apprenticeship, sweating through the first lesson with a veteran's eyes on his every move, was all the railroad demanded before sending a man into the furnace. Miss A reading on the water glass, and the fine came down, $5, $10, $20, docked from a wage that barely kept food on the table. One mistake, and your name vanished from the schedule, replaced by another desperate man willing to risk his life for a chance at steady work. But in 1905, something cracked. The Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen and Enginemen gathered in a smoke-filled union hall, the air thick with the memory of men lost to boiler blasts and company neglect. They passed a resolution: no more silent suffering, no more pretending that survival was just luck. The text was blunt: quarterly safety valve tests, mandatory calibration of the water glass, and a real apprenticeship. Not just 30 hours, but proof a fireman could read the signs that meant life or death. Violations would bring fines on the railroad, not just the man with the shovel. For the first time, the fireman's knowledge was written into the rulebook, not as a courtesy, but as a demand. This was the spark, no longer a single man standing alone against the firebox, but a collective voice refusing to be erased. The Brotherhood's resolution was more than a plea for better tools or a safer cab. It was a declaration. Name us skilled, because the work demands it. Name us skilled, because the cost of ignorance is measured in bodies. The fight was no longer just for a wage, but for the right to survive a shift and be remembered after the whistle faded. The fireman's sweat turned profit into myth. His body was the cost buried beneath every whistle and postcard. Today, industries still call danger a ladder, and still burn through lives to keep engines running. The blackened overalls change, but the calculation does not. When labor's sacrifice is erased, exploitation thrives in the silence. How many more stories will be lost under the roar? Share your thoughts below.